We don't often have a guest like we do today with John Cairney. He's got such an interesting background, blending academic pursuits, professor now at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, Canadian by birthright, spent a good part of his early life in Canada. We're going to learn how he got from Canada to Australia. We're also going to learn how he took academic pursuits and over time blended them with practical business pursuits and then back to academia and then sort of a little bit of a back and forth, which I find fascinating because it's not often you hear that kind of a story. So John, can't thank you enough. Welcome to the Best Boss Ever podcast.
Thanks, Carl. Happy to be here.
Well, listen, we always sort of go back in time a little bit because as the essence of the show suggests, we want to understand not only how you got to where you are, but who was the most influential leader or boss or professor or coach or whatever you had along the way, what those learnings were and how you've applied them to your career path so far.
Well, I knew you were going to ask that question, so I did some thinking on it because nothing really immediately sprung to mind, to be honest with you. But probably the person that I would single out is a professor that I came in contact with when I was doing my master's degree at Queen's University, and his name was William Leese, and Bill Leese was is a philosopher actually. By training, and he's American. He studied at, I think he did his PhD at the University of San Diego under a pretty famous philosopher there. And his area of interest was environmental studies, environmental science. And he wrote a book in 1970, 1972 called The Domination of Nature. And you may have heard of a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which was kind of a famous, one of the first real popular books on the environmental crisis or the coming environmental crisis. And Silent Spring was all about if we keep spraying DDT everywhere, the birds aren't going to be around and there'll be no more singing. You won't hear birds. Anyways, Bill wrote the intellectual part of that. I guess he wrote the academic response to Silent Spring. Had a really interesting career, ended up in the area of risk management and did a lot of consulting with government, with business, with different things. And so I'm at Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. I'm starting my master's degree. This guy named Bill Leese comes in as the Exxon Valdez Eco Research Chair. And if you remember the Exxon Valdez,
who doesn't? I mean, if you're our age, dude, you remember that.
You remember it. Part of their settlement was they had to fund these research chairs in environmental policy across Canada and the United States. Bill got one. I was pretty idealistic. Maybe I still am. When I was a young man, I was pretty anti-big business and skeptical of these things. And Bill comes in with this Exxon Valdez chair, and I'm like, oh, this sounds like a corporate payoff, and I don't want to have anything to do with this. And Bill reached out to me because someone in the sociology department where I was said, oh, this guy's really good at social psychology, and this is what you're looking for. You should talk to John. And I had this just incredible 15 minutes with this man, learned about his career, how he worked. The first thing he said to me is, he goes, look, I took this chair, but under the condition that nobody would tell me what to do. And that was the first thing I signed. That was the contract that you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to do my own thing, but yes, I'll take the money. And I just was exposed for the first time in my career to someone who had been able to manage that complicated and, as you said, very uncommon relationship between being engaged in the world, working with business, working with government, acting as a consultant in essence, but still producing really, really high quality academic work. And I just thought that's what I want to do. And I remember one of the projects that we worked on very, very early on was around expert panels and how you use expert panels to solve complicated policy issues. And Bill sent me down to Washington, and I spent 2 days in the National Institute of Science, National Institute of Health, and I met with people. And I remember flying back to Toronto on a red eye, having spent the day in Washington, meeting all these really incredible people. I met Bill in a bar. We had a martini, and he leaned back in his chair and he said, so what do you think of all this? And I said, I love it. I am just so pumped up right now. I could spend my life doing this. And he said, well, you're hooked. And so that was the beginning of it. So he understood, and he was a huge mentor of mine.
That's a really good story because you, in so many words, learned at the knee of, on the one hand, a philosopher, right? Which by definition is around ideology and ideals and that sort of thing. And then takes, obviously, a gift at the time. The chair coming out of the Exxon Valdez spill, and for our younger audience members that don't recall that, it was, I don't know, what, 45, 50 years ago, something like that?
Yeah. Well, would have
Long
been
time
in the
ago.
80s, late 90s.
Big oil tanker, Exxon Mobil, crashes into the coast, in the, not the Bering Sea, but the sort of
Yeah, North Atlantic, up towards the Arctic.
northern Pacific, up towards the Arctic, right?
Yeah, you're right.
On the coast of, I want to say it was Alaska at the time.
Yeah, it was. You're right. That was that
Yeah.
area. It was definitely the
Right.
Pacific.
Yeah. And then the oil went everywhere.
Yep. Massive spill.
Massive spill. Birds died. They really didn't know how to collect and control the spill. So obviously, subsequent research, analytics, understanding not just what happened or why it happened, but what the aftermath was and the massive cleanup required, with the premise being, let's not have this happen again, right?
Yeah.
So you learn from a master, and now, however many years on, you're actually living what you fell in love with at Bill Leese's knee, which I think is really awesome. So you get your master's, you leave there, and you're hooked.
Mm.
So give us a sentence on actually what you're hooked on, and then what you did subsequent to leaving Queen's University in Toronto.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because I wasn't hooked on necessarily where I was going in my academic career. I was hooked on the idea that you could have those two things and you could blend them together. So I was on my way from Queen's to McMaster University, and I was kind of tilting towards the environmental stuff. I was, and I kind of got flagged as Bill Leese's apprentice. And so I had all these people coming out and saying, oh, we've got this environmental policy project that we're doing, and this is, we'd love to have you involved. So I kind of had a whole ton of action, opportunities. I went to McMaster and I was working with someone there, and I was kind of setting my career up. And I realized that while I loved what Bill was able to do in his career, my passion wasn't in environmental science. It was in health and medicine. And that's what I started with, and that's what I really loved. And so I pivoted, and I went to another university, Western University, a little bit further down the highway, and ended up finishing my PhD. And I did a dual degree at a time where dual degrees weren't a thing. I did all the coursework in epidemiology and biostatistics, so I had a really firm grounding in research methods and statistical analysis around health and big databases in health. But I also did my degree in sociology, and my brand of sociology was social psychology, so I was interested in human behavior. So I kind of married the two together, and I did it at a time where it wasn't a formal pathway, but it was incredible training. And then from there, I spent some time in medicine. I had a research chair, and I was in psychiatry at University of Toronto. I kind of drifted into studying children and pediatrics, and particularly interested in motor disorders in kids. And that's where my path started to shift towards physical activity, exercise, and then now more recently sport. So, I think if I were to define my arc, and I've said this to some of my students, and it definitely was not, a kind of singular pathway. It was
Rarely
a
is.
whole lot
It
of ups and
rarely is.
downs. Exactly. And the consistent thing, though, was always that I followed my passion. What I was interested in, what I really got excited about, has always been what's motivated me and what's driven me forward.
Well, that, I would say, is not surprising on the one hand. On the other hand, any listener out there who's listened to more than a few episodes of what we do here at the Best Boss Ever would recognize that underlying passion, commitment, purpose, intentionality, whatever modifier you put around it, is absolutely a common thread to those of us who've been lucky enough to follow a passion or move forward with purpose. And to your point, the arc is never an arc. It's a dipsy, topsy-turvy, round the corner, back on the road again.
Messy. Yeah.
It's all those things. But somehow that's what life is. And, it's as I said at the end of season 4, it's a dance. It's a dance of passion. It's a dance of intuition, and all of these pursuits that seem sort of esoteric at the outset, but then when you really do a little bit of self-reflection, you find that many of those elements make up, if you will, your DNA, not the physical DNA, but your approach to all these things. So, wow, you go from pediatrics, you go to, find your way to being super interested in movement, in motor skills, but seemingly the focus was on disorders as opposed to optimizing movement across children, right? And if
Yep.
you could identify what, why, and the cause, if you will, of
Yep.
disorder, you could hopefully remedy those elements going forward. Is that
Yeah.
some close? Is that close?
It's very close. I really became interested in a group of kids that for no apparent reason, like not a biological or medical reason that we can find, are clumsy. It's the most direct way to say it. And we all know maybe we are that person, or we all know somebody who was like that. And you can look at that and you can kind of laugh it off, and you can say, well, people are just clumsy, right? It's not, sport isn't their thing, physical activity isn't their thing. But these are often kids that are not just struggling on the pitch, on the sporting field. These are kids that have difficulty tying their shoelaces. Not that anyone does that anymore, by the way, but buttoning a shirt, using knives, forks, all those everyday activities. And they're kind of a hidden cohort, and not a lot was known about them, and not a lot was really guiding how parents and other people navigate how to best support them. There wasn't a magical cure for it. There's been all sorts of attempts tried to train kids out of their clumsiness, and those things don't work. And so to me, it was just fascinating. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about the area. And then I started to think, wow, what would growing up be like if you couldn't do the same thing that other kids took for granted, and you weren't able to play in the same way that other kids were able to play? What impact would that have? Physical well-being, on your mental well-being, on your social development? And that started 15 plus years of studies and investigations, from population-based studies where we studied kids in the real world, so to speak. We followed them over time, to lab studies, to a whole range of things, and a bunch of collaborations globally. It was such a rewarding period of my life. But again, I think the other thing that I suffer from, and probably many people on your show do as well, I kind of get bored when I'm in one lane for too long. And part of it is the need I think I have to kind of reinvent myself, to say, well, what am I going to do next? Am I going to stay in this lane, or am I going to do something else? And so the pivot out of that area was the broader area of sport. When I became interested in I was always interested in mental health, so I became interested in athlete mental health. How do we understand what keeps athletes well mentally, not just from preparing for games, but all the bits in between, and how do they manage the complexity of their lives? And that led eventually into an interest in the business side of sports. So it's just following passions. I probably should shout out another person who was really influential in my life, because that sport theme has been there for a long time, and that was my older brother, Leslie. And Les was the first. I dedicated my first baseball book to him. He's no longer with us, and Les was the first intelligent sport fan I ever knew. He loved sport, and more than I did when I was it was quite an age difference between us. And I used to kind of get mad because he used to dominate the television watching all sport, and I wanted to watch cartoons or something like that. We used to fight about it. But Les was, he was a fan, but he could talk about what was happening. He could talk about the business of sport. He could talk about any aspect of it intelligently. And I thought, it's possible to be a rabid sport fan and also be smart. And in fact, there's a ton of people out there that are in that category. And so that's always been with me. And I think there was a certain point in my time when I started to realize that I could do more in sport in my academic work, that I could be an intelligent sport fan, and that I could follow that passion and learn from what my brother had started many, many years ago and follow on from it. So that was another thread that was pretty important in my uneven arc of craziness.
Right. Well, that's we're starting to put the puzzle together here. And the disparate
Let me know when you get
pieces,
a diagnosis.
Yeah, right. I got that. The disparate pieces that actually come together in a really stunningly visual mosaic, to use an art analogy here. Before we get a little deeper into that, because I want to, You mentioned 15 years of work, lots of research, lots of studies, lots of panels, lots of that. Those of us who hear that and have been hearing it most of our lives, this, that, or the other study. Did you have any experience, John, where a study or a group of studies on a particular subject matter actually led to significant learning, significant change, significant adaptation, if you will, of what the study results pointed toward? And give us an example of that, because I think by and large, most people hear about a research study and roll their eyes. Yeah, great. Somebody just wrote a big check. A bunch of people went out and studied this, that, or the other thing. And then what? Right?
Yeah. Well, we did, I think, and we call that impact now. And it wasn't a thing when I started my academic career. I mean, impact was you published a paper and everybody celebrated the publication of the paper. You got a grant, right? Now it's about, well, what change actually happened as a result of what you did? Or what can you point your finger to that you had what you said? You changed something. Probably the biggest thing that we did, as I said, was we started studying an area where there wasn't very much in that area known about that. And we started to publish things, and very intentionally, in mainstream medical journals to raise awareness. And one of the papers that we published more than 15 plus years ago now, was on the fact that these kids were at greater risk for obesity and also poor physical fitness, and that these things were then early cardiometabolic markers for future disease. And that really, at least in Canada, and I think in Europe and other parts of the world, really changed the conversation about this isn't just clumsiness. This isn't just something that kids grow out of or something that you shouldn't pay attention to. This is a risk factor for long-term medical complications. And you started to see that more and more in the medical literature and more of that. So to me, though, the real rewarding thing was the number of parents who reached out to me directly and said, I read your work, which is almost never happens to an academic. Right. And the first thing I said to them was, I'm sorry you read my work. I mean, it wasn't really written for you, so good on you for plowing through it. And it was so helpful for us to understand what was going on with our child, but also to then bring that information to our family physician, to our pediatrician, to the healthcare provider that we had, and say, look, this is what's happening. This is the research that's coming out. What can we do to support my child? Where are we going to go next? And so I also got hooked, I guess, through those experiences in really wanting to make sure that I wasn't just writing an article for 10 other people in the world that would read, that I could do something that could translate, that could do something that would have an impact. And I could try to write and speak and do things like this to reach that wider audience and translate that information. And that's where the popular books started to come out and some of the other work that I do. Yeah.
Right. No, that's great insight, because too often the academic pursuits yield, the long-ish, dry-ish, dense, hard to really, break down and understand if you're a casual reader and not a student or a student of the topic. So that's very helpful, and I applaud you for getting that part right, because it's getting it understood and getting it to a broader audience and more mainstream awareness is one thing, but they need to be able to understand what the heck you just said, right? And what the studies reflect. So I applaud that in a heartfelt way.
Well, probably, Carl, the other person that was influential in that was another family member, my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law had a really interesting career in his own right, but he ended his career as in investments. He was a financial planner. My brother-in-law was the guy, and we did not see eye to eye on many, many, many things. Enormous amount of mutual respect for each other. And Ed would be the guy that I always heard in the back of my head going, so what? Who cares? What have you done? Right? And I know many colleagues who've had those people in their lives, and they tend to be the academics who do the kind of work that I do, and that sort, because you have this sense of I don't want to just be that ivory tower guy. I want to be somebody who's doing something that matters. So I love those people. I love being challenged that way, and I think that was, I'll give them credit for that. Nothing else, but I'll give them credit for that.
Okay, well, there you go. Brother-in-law, you get a gold star, one gold star.
Glenn Gold's he's a good man.
So let's go to the intelligent sport fan comment you made, because that's pretty cool. And it's, I get asked this question a lot, John, as I'm sure you do too, being a professor and having a lot of students. I get it via networking and, friends who have kids or friends who have kids who have friends. And they all say the same thing. I want to get into sport marketing. Really? Yeah. You want to get into sports marketing. Well, what part of sports marketing? Well, I don't know, just sport marketing. And I said, league, team, brand like Nike or Adidas, agency like CAA or IMG or Endeavor, events like the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
There's so many ways and pathways to explore and build a really great career in sport. And it's really an exercise in, I think, identifying what you don't want to do as much as it is identifying what you do want to do. So over to you, and let's hear the story about becoming an intelligent sport fan and how that has led you to, we're still in Canada. I don't think we've gotten to Oz yet. So I want to hear that bit as well.
Yeah, sure. I think your comments, I agree with you completely. And one of the things one has to be careful about is usually sport starts out as a passion. It's sport was an escape for me. Like I enjoyed just watching a football game without having to think about anything else. And so there's a danger when you combine your passion, your hobby with your interest. You don't have that hobby anymore. You start to see sport differently. So I would say to people, there's a cautionary tale in that too.
Right.
So don't go too far if you're not prepared for it. For me was, so again, going back to that, carrying on that story, having that experience of doing a little bit of the translation stuff, how do I take something and write it for a non-academic audience, became a personal challenge for me, right? And that really led then to my first non-academic book project, which was on immaculate innings in baseball. And I chose sport because I knew quite a bit about it. I was passionate about it, but because I'd seen and been, I'd read journalists or people who I really appreciated had that gift of being able to tell a really powerful narrative, whether it's a story of a player or an event or whatever, but weave in a little bit of history, a little bit of sociology sometimes, a little bit of politics, a little bit of economics, and weave that all together and tell a really, what I would say, gripping but intelligent story. And that was I set that task for myself. Okay, I'm going to write a book and I'm choosing baseball, and this is what I'm going to do. And I told the story of the then 77 pitchers who had pitched a 9-strike inning in baseball. And I used each of their stories to talk a little bit about what was happening in the game, because it went from like 1888 all the way to 2015, I think was the cutoff point for me at the time. And so just kind of doing that and playing with and learning how to write and not be an academic. And it was really tough because I could catch myself. Oh, you're going too far down the rabbit hole here. Stats are coming in fast and furious, and you're testing hypotheses and stuff like that. And that's not what I wanted to do. So that was it for me. That was the transition point. But it was, again, looking for people who I really respected, who did that bridging really well, wrote really intelligently, but everyone could understand what they were writing and they were excited.
Right. So let me play back for you what I think I just heard.
Okay.
Up through 2015, you identified 77 pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball that pitched nine
consecutive
strike, 3-up, 3-down innings.
Correct.
Even if they only pitched one of those, they were on the list of 77.
That's right.
Okay, so put that in compare and contrast. Up through 2015, what is the macro number of the number of pitchers who pitched in Major League Baseball that wasn't one of the 77?
I tried to do
thousands, right? Thousands.
Easily. I tried to do a calculation of innings, and it was like, hundreds of millions of innings. Like, it was just ridiculous. It was great. It wasn't hundreds of millions, but it was millions of innings.
Right. Massive numbers. So the rare, you can easily and accurately say that a 3-up, 3-down, 9-pitch, 9-strike inning is a very rare feat in Major
Yeah,
League Baseball.
not as rare as a perfect game, but
Right.
not that far off.
Right.
And the perfect game, everyone knows about. Everybody, because
Exactly.
I said it unfolds, right? You could go to get a hot dog and miss an immaculate inning, and you come back to your seat. And a lot of times, there's more awareness of it now. Like it's funny, I get tweets and or whatever they call it now on X and stuff. When an immaculate inning happens, I get
Right.
notified by all these people.
I
And say,
think
oh,
that's
another
great.
one for your book.
I think that's great. That's awesome. All
Yeah.
right. So you write the book. Are you in Canada when you write that book?
Yep, but I'm getting
Okay.
close to moving, so
All right.
we're almost at that point. Yeah. I wrote that when I was So that was published in 2015, and then fast forward to 2019, I get a phone call, and it's a international recruiting firm, and they say to me, "Look, there's this position in Australia. They're looking for a head of school. Your name has been come up a few times. Would you be interested in this?" Now, 6 months prior to that, I'd been in Australia, and it was the third time I'd been to Australia. And I brought my family with me on the third time because they said, if you go back and you're not coming back unless we go with you this time. And we did the tourist thing. We went, saw the Sydney Opera House and went up to Cairns and did the Great Barrier Reef and all that stuff. And it was a really great trip. My kids were about 9, 8, and 12, 13 at that time. They had a really good time. Wife had a great time. And then we get this phone call. It was like, that's unusual. And I was at a point in my career where I wanted to take on more leadership. I was interested in senior leadership roles. I was director of graduate studies at University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology where I was, and I was interested in doing more and learning more about administration in universities. And so everything just kind of lined up. But I went over and I thought, I'm not going to do it. Like, I really didn't think it was going to happen. But I came here where I'm sitting right now, and I met with people. I saw the university. I knew what they wanted to do. I could see why they were interested in me. I could see the fit. And I remember getting offered the job and then boarding a plane for the 26-hour flight back to home and thinking, how am I going to tell my then 85-year-old mother that I'm moving to Australia with my family? So
Taking her grandkids away.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have happened though if my wife Monique was not
Fully on.
one supportive of it, and mostly the kids were. My son definitely had voted no. Sadly, he realized it wasn't the democracy that he thought it was to that point.
Right.
But everybody's done well and enjoyed the move, and it's been great for us.
Well, you stayed in the Commonwealth. There, you have that going for you, right?
That's right.
So you move. So it's 2019. Now we're like in, current zone. You move in 2019, and then, the unthinkable happens, which is the whole COVID world.
That's right.
And Australia took a very aggressive stance. I think I'm observing this from afar. You actually lived there while this was going on. And I don't want to belabor COVID. We all know what it was, particularly in the world of sport where live matches, live games, arenas, stadiums, cricket grounds and pitches were all shut down. Nobody could do anything. And then we came out of it, and it was almost like a slingshot. And I use that phrase intentionally because the rebound effect post 18 to 24 months of no live events, no live sport, no live concerts, no live theater, no live Broadway, no live opera. None of that was allowed.
Yep.
The pent-up demand, I think, while many anticipated some level of that, I think the pure volume of what happened in, starting, call it mid-2021 up through and including the year we just wrapped, 2024, was amazing in terms of the number of people who came back in droves. And in the business side of sport, music, entertainment, theater, what we also learned as a collective industry was that people were absolutely willing to pay for a better, more uplifting, more, if you will, exclusive VIP hospitality experience.
Mm-hmm.
That is still the case today. So start with sort of your whatever during COVID moments enlightened you or sort of laid some groundwork for what has happened since 20. Let's get to the current role you have right now, which is pretty awesome because the Olympics in 2032 are coming to Brisbane, Australia, which is where you're sitting for this interview. So, and you've got a
Yeah.
role. So we want to
Yeah,
hear all about that.
absolutely. Well, I would say I didn't see two things when I took this job. I didn't see COVID. No one did. Well, if someone did, they're not sharing it.
Right.
And the other one was 2032, right? So I'll say this about COVID. I mean, look, if you're I won't call it small, but if you're an island in about the furthest reaches of the Pacific that you can be, it's pretty easy to manage COVID. Really, every state managed it differently, though. And in Queensland, we were lucky; we didn't have the Melbourne experience, which was they shut down, and it was really difficult on people there. We did targeted shutdowns. Look, I was pretty unscathed. I mean, I remember sending texts back to my family, and my family was, in Canada wasn't really that bad either, but they had it rough and much rougher than we did. But as a leader, what COVID did for me was, I think in a lot of ways, really sharpened a focus for me. I came in and I was barely in the seat. The seat was still cold, and we had a crisis. So it went from went from understanding where you are and all those other things to crisis management. And I would never recommend that as a pathway for somebody going into a new leadership role, but it sharpened me really quickly. I mean, I had to learn things about what we did really, really quickly. But I think I was also a calming element, because I remember sitting with my executive team in the room, and everybody was just kind of going, what are we going to do? How are we going to shift everything to online learning in 7 days? How are we going to manage this? How are we going to manage that? And I was just the guy who was asking all the dumb questions. Well, how do we do this before that? And I think it just got everybody down and just focused on where they were. And I often walked out of those meetings with feeling like I didn't contribute anything, but the temperature was lowered, and it was just being able to focus on what do we need to do today and what are we going to do tomorrow. And I didn't have the ability to reach back in time and say, well, in 2017 we managed this and we did that. I didn't know any of that, and I didn't know much about my people or anything. And so I was getting to know them, learning who they were, how they reacted, and I was just the guy asking all the simple questions. And it really was great for me. I learned a ton, and I think it was good for everybody else, because they learned about me, and we also learned together how we're going to manage this thing. So it was a positive, I can say positive experience. It was the best it could have been under the circumstances that we had.
And by and large, everybody who was in a leadership role, barring those companies that didn't make the turn because they weren't, in all likelihood, they weren't solvent to the degree they needed to be anyway.
Yeah.
They were hanging by a thread, if you will. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So the role that, obviously you're still in that leadership role, obviously those waters have completely calmed, but you have a new, very exciting, very challenging, I would say, project on the horizon. We talked about it at the top of the show. It's 7 years away. I mean, I'm sitting here in North County, San Diego in California. You're in Brisbane, Australia. We're inside 3 years for the Olympic Games, 88 miles up the road.
Yep.
And I promise you the 7 years between now and 1932 are going to go by in a blink of an eye. All that said, seemingly you're still a sitting professor. You've got classes, you've got students, and at the same time, you are a significant leadership piece of what is coming in 7 years. So sort of here you are again, academic, foot in both worlds, which you learned from Bill Lease early on. So let's understand, which foot is where.
Yep. Yeah, well, look, and this is where I think you can actually start to see the threads coming together. Your listeners will be thankful. People watching this will be thankful we're finally pulling it together. I mean, it's hard actually when you look at the history of the Olympics to find a really good, I think, to find a really good example of how a university or universities have really been connected to the organizing committee and the games in a way that isn't just purely transactional, right? So in LA, it'll be about facilities and venues, right? And I remember Wasserman saying, the great thing about us, right, is we don't have to manage any of that stuff because UCLA has the stadium and they do these things. They do mega events all the time. And so it's just great for us. Now, that's not us. We don't have a stadium where you can put 100,000 people. What we're interested in, and this is why I said it's hard to find, how do we bring all the things that you can unlock inside a university to help deliver the best possible games that you can? Workforce, 100%. We train sport scientists, we train sport coaches, we train sport business people, all of that stuff. We're 60,000 students, 50 some odd thousand students at UQ. We're a huge source of potential volunteer labor. There's a huge labor force component to that that's now and will be that reaching that point and beyond. But then there's all the research that we do. There's all the stuff that happens inside a competitive top 50 university in the world, which we are. Number 2 in the world for sport-related subjects, but top 50 overall. So one of the things that was in the games bid, I'll give you one example. One of the things that was in the games bid was this needed to be a climate positive games. Now they've kind of walked back from that a little bit because it's bloody hard to have a climate positive game when everyone in the world has to fly a long distance basically to get to Australia to compete. We've got a group in the engineering school who for 20 years has been working on sustainable aviation fuel, right? This could be a major turning point in terms of how you then take care of that side of the ledger for thinking about a climate positive games. We've got people in engineering, again, in architecture, who are building sustainable housing. So looking at that model around how you do that for the athlete village. And I could go on, medical technologies for injury prevention, all that kind of stuff. But the real key, and this goes back to the early theme that we had before, is yes, everyone knows that expertise resides within universities. Everybody knows what universities can do. But getting it out and using it and accessing it and making it accessible and really having an impact is the hard part. So that goes back to that long arc that started with Bill Lease. How do we, make all the stakeholders, not just the organizing committee, but it's going to be a pipeline for business and a whole bunch of other things, aware of and accessible to that expertise when they need it, where they need it. And it's not a small challenge because there isn't a giant Rolodex somewhere, and that's another term that most of our listeners aren't going to know, where you can just say, here's expert X on this. It's diffuse, it's spread out, it's hard to find. So it's about joining up that piece. But then it's also about, going back to something you said earlier, it's also about, well, how do we change the role of the academic? And I'll give you a concrete example. I've got what we call industry-focused researchers in my school. So they sit half-time in my school and half-time in industry. I've got 4 of them in the Queensland Academy of Sport, which is the main high-performance training center for the state. And their job is to listen, to interrogate, to identify with their colleagues in the QAS, what are the problems that we need to solve now and in the future, and how do we bring that expertise to do that? And the answer to every question is not we need to design a 20-year study that's going to answer X. We need to come up with solutions now. And that's a different way for academics to think, to live, to work. And it means a whole bunch of things that we haven't actually fully sorted out yet, which is they're not going to be necessarily publishing articles like I published articles 20 years ago.
Right.
They're solving problems, and that needs to count too. So the way we reward academics needs to change. So we're talking about a pretty big shift in how we do business inside the university to make ourselves relevant. But that's my challenge. That's what I want to, not just mine, it's the universities, but that's what I'm embracing is how do we change what we do to bring and unlock all that expertise to make this the best games that we can possibly deliver and beyond. Not just 2032's a bunch of weeks in September and August.
Right.
How do we make it?
It's not even a bunch of weeks. It's 17 days.
17 days and then Paralympics, right? So, it's how do we have a long-term legacy to keep that going so that, I remember when you and I have a common friend, Rick Burton, when Rick was here giving a talk, he said, look, it's a good chance that Brisbane will get the games again because it's a model the IOC has been moving to anyways. And just the climate and everything else makes this a really desirable place for hosting the games. So how do we set up for the next games so that we're further ahead than we are? So that's the vision. That's what we want to do.
Well, that's the key word, vision. I mean, and if you can, clearly articulate or visualize a vision, so you sort of know where you want to go. That's the biggest first step worth taking. You can work backwards. You can reverse engineer where you need to be or want to be 7 years hence, but you can also have an overlay that goes well beyond the end of the 2032 games, not just for Brisbane, but you said it. It's a paradigm shift for the business and academic model at an institution of higher learning on how they choose to solve problems, solving problems, big statement, as opposed to writing research papers. Now, that doesn't mean
Generating new problem.
Right, exactly. That doesn't mean there's no place for research papers, because we both know there is. But
Absolutely.
the practical approach to problem solving, and you can solve what you can solve today. You might identify a potential problem 7 years hence, but you don't have the tools to do it today. But you take 3, 4, 5 steps toward the vision of 2032, and all of a sudden a solution sort of, if you will, rises out of the work that you have already accomplished. And it gives you, the tool or the insight, probably the better word, that you need to tackle that problem head on. This is going to be really fun to watch, I got to say, because y'all are taking an approach that is very real world. It's very now. I mean, this whole word agile business has been around for the better part of 20 years.
Yep.
And I've yet to find somebody who can actually well define it and then give objective results that were achieved after having deployed an agile business model. But a lot of what I'm hearing you say, John, sort of rings that bell.
Yep. That's and a lot of it is actually doing what you're doing. It's bringing in ideas and thinking from other places. So, one of the other things I did, because I decided I didn't have enough on my plate, was I decided to go back to school a couple of years ago, and I did a postgrad degree in organizational leadership at the Said Business School at Oxford. And part of the reason I did that was because I wanted some more insight into leadership and, different models and things like that. But I also wanted to see what was happening inside people who were thinking in different industries about how you bring together these pieces. Because, we use the words like joining up and linking and systems thinking and all of these kinds of things. But really what it's about is networking and bringing together being nimble enough to bring together the right constellation of people and organizations and expertise to solve those problems that you identified, which are unsolvable by universities alone, by business alone, by government alone. And I think, there's a lot written on this theoretically, and there's a lot of things that are happening that are exciting in different pockets, but that's really the innovation moving forward. And universities won't survive. We simply cease to exist unless we can sit in that pocket and demonstrate our worth. And I think that's the challenge. That's our 21st century challenge for us, is how do we survive this century and centuries beyond? And it means we need to rethink what we do fundamentally. But I think you said vision. To me it's the citizen scientist or the applied scientist. It's like imagining that everyone's not in the ivory tower, that they're actually distributed all throughout ecosystem, call it whatever you want. And they're bringing the resources back and they're bringing resources out, and it's a two-way street. And our students are there because that's where they want to be. They don't want to be in the classroom. They want to be doing all these other things. And that's
the student body, if you will, those few hundred you've identified. One, they're there because they want to be. Two, they're probably little Johns in the making, right? Because somebody's going to say something, do something, show them something that's going to turn their passion light on, and off you go. Listen, this is such a fascinating conversation. It's amazing how we've burned through 46 minutes of this episode. So what I want to do now, and we could go on, and I so appreciate your willingness to share with the audience here. We're going to go now to our 3 hot questions. Yep. Ask everybody the same 3. So the first one is your favorite mistake, the one where and those around you knew that you really messed up, but how you dealt with that mistake and what you learned from it.
I remember I had a wonderful experience once where I had built a kind of new research lab. It was my first one. We were overseas. We were at a conference, and I had all my postdocs and my PhD students. It was quite a big lab, and we're all sitting, we're having a glass. It was in France, great place to have a conference. We're having a glass of wine. We decided to skip out the last session and go have a glass of wine at this lovely cafe. And I remember one of my PhD students turning to me and saying, "So, are we doing a good job?" And my heart just sunk because I thought, oh, how am I? I said, "Of course you're doing a good job. If you were I would have told you if I was unhappy with your job, but I didn't tell them that I was happy with what they were doing." And I realized that that's a challenge for people like me that are always flying above the clouds and pushing and soaring forward and out, that not only you say bring people along on the journey, but it's remembering to meet people where they are and to not only be part of the journey, but also to reward them and to recognize what they're doing and their accomplishments and achievements. It was a great lesson for me, and it was good that we had it over wine because we all had a good laugh about it. But I always took that. I don't know if it was a huge mistake, but I would have persisted that way. And that was Bill Lease, by the way. Like that, he did the same thing. I remember sitting in a room with a bunch of other people, and we're going, "What does this guy want us to do? Like, he's given us great opportunity, but are we doing the right thing? Is he happy with what we're doing?" And that big lesson for leadership there.
Yeah, and I mean, it actually goes to the third question, and I'll get there in a second. But I guess there's, I would say, a little bit of a vulnerability there where you are willing to meet them not only where they are, but give them honest feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think every student appreciates that 360-degree view. But if one of those gets left out, you're going to hear about it, right?
Well, there's another quick story. I was out with my kids one time, and it was right when cameras started being phones, and my kids were being silly, and one of them took a shot of me, and I had this look on my face like, "Oh, you're kidding me," like that. And I showed it to my students, and they go, "Yeah, we've seen that look before."
Nice. Okay, there you go. You can run, but you can't hide, right? All right, that's good stuff, John. The second one is fun. This is the concert, the live show that you've attended, your favorite one, where a female singer-songwriter or a female-led band was the headliner.
Yeah, I got a bunch. The one that probably stands out for me, and again, this isn't going to resonate with some of your listeners, but Sarah McLachlan. So, I think most people know her, and she's hasn't been around as active as she was back in the 90s and that era, but Lilith Fair and all that stuff. But I saw her actually when she was just kind of getting going. So she used to play at a really small, she used to play universities, and I saw her in a university pub, when she was, I think maybe had her first album out or something like that. And you already knew that this was someone special. Her voice was incredible, and she wrote her own songs and all of that stuff. I don't know that we ever fully saw where she was going to end up, but it was pretty exciting to see her in those early days and then watch her career kind of go from there. So that's
a great one. That's a great one. I will pointedly say that you are the only one who ever called out Sarah McLachlan, and I still have aspects of her body of work on disparate playlists that I have. So I'm a fan for sure. Good call out. The last one is what I call the pithy one. You just talked about it. Words matter. What you say as important as what you don't say. So the question is your favorite word and why?
It's a tough one. I mean, I didn't know you were going to ask that. I should have paid more attention to those podcast links that you taught me. Look, I think the one that comes immediately to mind, so that's the one I'll say, is disruption. And the reason I chose that one is because I'm fascinated by it. And I think a lot of times you can see it as a negative. Disruption means that I was doing something I really enjoyed and I'm disrupted and I can't do it anymore. To me, disruption is like turning a corner. It's opening a new door. It's more possibilities. And even though sometimes it might come in a form that's threatening or challenges us to do things differently, if you've got a kind of long-term, I always say I'm a long-term optimist. I allow myself short-term cynicism, but I'm a long-term optimist. And so disruptions are just part of a journey that gets you to a better place ultimately, or at least a place where things are different and challenging in different ways. And so I'll go with disruption.
I like that a lot. And, when disruption begins, it can be super uncomfortable. The more you live with recurring disruption, regardless of the form that it takes, you become less uncomfortable with it, and you recognize that it's absolutely just part of the journey. You're going to come to a fork in the road, and you're going to have to make a choice. And you've obviously made some great choices in your career, John, with lots more to come. I can't thank you enough for being a guest on the Best Boss Ever podcast.
It was tons of fun, Carl. Thank you.